Every rock fan has been there. You fall in love with a band, defend them in every argument, until one album, one change in sound, or one bizarre decision makes everything fall apart. Suddenly, the band you once idolized becomes the one you love to trash the most. That breaking point is exactly what we're exploring today in the 10 most hated 70s rock bands by their own fans. This isn't a list of bad bands. These are huge 70s rock acts that, at some point, managed to seriously upset their own fan base, whether by moving too close to pop, releasing an overly experimental record, diving into the disco wave, or making business decisions that felt like pure sellout. Before we start the countdown, here's a quick favor. If you enjoy backstage stories, drama between bands and fans, and controversial lists like this, make sure to subscribe, drop a like, and turn on the notification bell. That tells the algorithm and us that you want a part 2. With that out of the way, let's head back to the 1970s when rock became big business, and some bands learned the hard way that there's no harsher enemy than a disappointed fan.
By the early 1970s, rock was no longer just garage noise. It had turned into a massive business. Bands were packing arenas, running huge tours, and releasing records that sounded bigger and cleaner than ever. On one side, arena rock brought huge choruses and radio-ready power ballads. On the other, progressive rock stretched songs into 10 or 15-minute journeys, full of solos and big concepts. Meanwhile, fans wanted something almost impossible. They wanted their favorite bands to conquer the world and somehow stay as pure as they were in the beginning. Every step toward pop, disco, slick production, or obvious business decisions felt, to many people, like a sign of selling out. That tension between growth and authenticity is the stage where the stories of these 10 bands play out.
Number 10, Pink Floyd. For many people, Pink Floyd is the ultimate 70s conceptual rock band. Full album stories, heavy themes, and live shows that felt almost otherworldly. The run of The Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, Animals, and The Wall put them on an almost untouchable pedestal. But that same sense of grandeur slowly pushed some fans away, who began to feel the music as distant, overly heavy, and wrapped in this idea of serious art that wasn't easy to connect with anymore. Over time, a clear split formed inside the fan base. On one side, those who saw Pink Floyd as the definition of depth and artistic ambition. On the other, those who started to view the band as the ultimate symbol of pretentious rock. The long tracks, dark concepts, and constant focus on alienation made some longtime admirers simply burn out. For that crowd, what once felt emotional and immersive turned into something slow, cold, and almost hermetic, as if the band wasn't interested in regular listeners anymore, only in feeding its own myth. The internal conflict only amplified that fatigue. Roger Waters took more and more creative control, tensions boiled over, and it all ended in a breakup and legal fights over the Pink Floyd name. Suddenly, being a fan also meant picking a side, the Waters era or the post-Waters era, the towering concepts or the attempts to move on after the chaos. The result is a band that is both worshipped and resented by different parts of its own audience. And that kind of emotional split is exactly the pattern we're going to see again and again in this list. Number 9, Genesis. In the 1970s, Genesis started out as a highly theatrical progressive rock band, with Peter Gabriel up front in elaborate costumes, telling strange, sprawling stories on stage during albums like Foxtrot, Selling England by the Pound, and The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. For fans of that era, the band was all about complex narratives, cryptic lyrics, and a stage presence that felt more like weird theater than straight rock.
When Gabriel left in 1975, exhausted by the pressure and wanting a different life, a lot of people felt like the real Genesis had just ended for good. But Genesis kept going. Drummer Phil Collins stepped up as lead vocalist on A Trick of the Tail, and the group still carried plenty of progressive elements for a while, yet their sound slowly became more concise, hook-driven, and radio-friendly, especially from the late 70s into the 80s. Commercially, it was a huge success. Albums like Duke and Invisible Touch pushed Genesis into the center of the pop rock universe, alongside Collins' own solo career, which exploded on the charts. For many newer listeners, that sleek, catchy version of Genesis became the real one. On the other side, the backlash was intense. Fans of the Gabriel era saw the pop turn as a kind of aesthetic betrayal. The band that once wrote long, multi-part suites was now on TV and bright 80s videos with punchy drum sounds and radio-ready choruses, feeding the narrative that Genesis had sold out for mainstream success. Clear fault lines formed inside the fan base, some insisting the true Genesis died in 1975, others arguing the group simply evolved and still slipped progressive touches under the pop surface. Even today, just mentioning the name Genesis is enough to reignite debates about artistic integrity, identity shifts, and how far a band can go before it loses the very fans who put it on the map.
Number 8. Yes. If there's one band that pushed progressive rock to the edge, it's Yes. In the 1970s, they became famous for long, intricate songs, constant tempo changes, rich harmonies, and albums that felt like full-on marathons. Think Close to the Edge and especially Tales from Topographic Oceans, a double LP with just 4 massive tracks. Even inside the prog community, that record picked up a reputation for being bloated and pretentious, adored by some as the peak of artistic ambition, and hated by others as the moment Yes finally went too far. That sense of excess eventually wore some of their own fans out. What once sounded epic started to feel self-indulgent to a lot of people. Endless solos, almost impenetrable lyrics, and heavily symbolic artwork gave the impression that the band was more focused on building a monument to itself than connecting with listeners. At the same time, the musical landscape was shifting. Punk was rising by openly attacking that kind of rock as distant, cold, and elitist, and a chunk of former Yes devotees began to look at the band with the same critical eye they used to reserve for the music press. When the decade flicked, the shock came from the opposite direction. After internal turmoil and lineup changes, Yes resurfaced in the 80s with 90125, embracing a much more pop, new wave-driven sound, with Owner of a Lonely Heart tearing up the charts and introducing the band to an entirely new crowd. That move split the fan base into almost rival camps. On one side, the fans of the 70s prog era. On the other, those who discovered Yes through the slick Trevor Rabin period, full of hooks and radio-ready choruses. For many old-school followers, the band that once wrote complex suites now sounded like just another slick arena rock act. So Yes ended up with a strange label, celebrated as one of prog's greatest names, yet also resented by parts of its own audience for going too far. First into excess, then into pop reinvention.
Number 7. Emerson, Lake, and Palmer. If 70s progressive rock has a reputation for being over-the-top, grandiose, and borderline excessive, Emerson, Lake, and Palmer are one of the main reasons why. The trio became a symbol of extreme virtuosity, keyboards everywhere, long multi-part suites, and arrangements that constantly seemed to be trying to prove something. For many fans, especially early on, that was exactly the charm. A band treating rock like concert hall music, blending classical, jazz, and electronics into something that felt completely new. But over time, that same attitude started to bother people. What sounded ambitious to some began to feel like pure showboating to others, as if everything revolved around how far they could push it. That larger-than-life mindset didn't stay in the studio, it hit the stage in a risky way.
During the Works era, the band launched a tour with a full symphony orchestra, dozens of extra musicians on the road, huge logistics, and costs that were almost absurd. Visually, it was stunning. Musically, it had brilliant moments. But financially and emotionally, it was a mess. Massive debts, growing internal tension, and the creeping feeling that the whole project had spiraled out of control. For a portion of the fan base, that tour became the perfect symbol of what had gone wrong. A trio that had lost all sense of limits, more focused on staging the biggest show possible than on keeping a stable relationship with the people who supported them. At the same time, critics were brutal, branding ELP as the ultimate caricature of pompous, pretentious prog, and that verdict inevitably rubbed off on some fans. A few longtime listeners started to feel almost embarrassed to admit they liked the band, while others doubled down and defended those records as the creative peak of the entire genre. Caught in that crossfire, Emerson, Lake, and Palmer ended up in a strange position, loved and hated with the same intensity, seen by many fans as the classic example of how the urge to always go bigger can eventually become the very reason your own base turns against you.
Number 6. Styx. For a lot of people, Styx is the very definition of 70s arena rock. Huge choruses, dramatic ballads, and albums built to sound massive in stadiums. Records like The Grand Illusion and Pieces of Eight pushed the band to the top, with songs that blended melodic rock, a touch of prog, and introspective lyrics wrapped in very polished production. That formula won them millions of fans, but it also planted a seed of discomfort. The bigger and cleaner the sound became, the more people started to see Styx as corporate rock, designed first and foremost to please radio, labels, and the market. That tension really blew up during the Kilroy Was Here era in the early 80s. The album came with a full storyline about censorship and control, a futuristic visual concept, and Mr. Roboto mixing rock, synth pop, and almost theatrical elements. For some fans, it was a bold, creative experiment. For others, it was proof the band had completely lost the plot. Many listeners who loved the more straightforward rock era of Styx began to look at this phase with secondhand embarrassment, as if the band had crossed the line between adventurous and downright ridiculous. Inside the group, things weren't much better. Disagreements over musical direction, personal burnout, and fights about who should be in charge creatively all helped poison the atmosphere. Parts of the fan base picked sides, defending certain members or eras while dismissing the rest. In the end, Styx became a band of extremes. To some, they're an underrated classic, a symbol of big, emotional, grand rock. To others, they're the perfect example of how too much polish and too much theatrics can turn a beloved band into a punchline among the very fans who grew up listening to them.
Number 5. Jefferson Airplane / Jefferson Starship / Starship. Very few bands have gone through as many identity shifts as this one. In the 60s, Jefferson Airplane stood as a symbol of psychedelia and counterculture, tied to the hippie movement, political lyrics, and a sense of experimentation that helped define an entire era. As the decade turned, the landscape changed, and so did the band. Lineups shifted, the sound grew more accessible, and the name evolved into Jefferson Starship, with a style that leaned much more toward 70s radio rock. For many fans of the original phase, that transition already felt like a watered-down version of the band, as if Rebellion had been traded for something far more respectable. Over time, the transformation went even further. By the 1980s, the group was performing simply as Starship, fully embracing slick, synth-heavy pop rock with glossy production and choruses engineered for the charts. The peak of that direction came with We Built This City, a song that became a massive commercial hit, but also one of the most hated tracks among critics and many fans, often held up as the ultimate symbol of plastic, overproduced rock completely detached from Jefferson Airplane's countercultural roots. For those who once saw the band as a voice of protest and experimentation, watching that same lineage attached to such a polished radio hit felt almost like cultural whiplash. All these shifts created a complicated relationship with the fan base. On one side, there are listeners who accept the entire timeline as something inevitable. Bands change, eras change, and this group simply did what it had to do to survive in each new decade.
On the other, there are fans who refuse to see Starship as any kind of a legitimate heir to the Airplane spirit, treating the 80s phase as a kind of alternate reality that denies everything that came before. Caught between those perspectives, the Jefferson Airplane/Starship story turned into a textbook example of how chasing commercial relevance can make a band look, to many longtime followers, not just different, but almost unrecognizable, and even worthy of outright rejection.
Number 4. Queen. In the 1970s, Queen was one of the bands that best balanced heaviness, theatricality, and arena rock. Albums like Sheer Heart Attack, A Night at the Opera, and News of the World built the image of a group that could do almost anything, but still felt rooted in big guitars, massive choruses, and a strong rock backbone. Little by little, though, another side started to stand out, a growing flirtation with funk, disco, and the dance floor, boosted by the massive success of Another One Bites the Dust. That groove-heavy side opened doors to new audiences. But it also put traditional rock fans on edge, worried that the band was drifting too far from where it started. For many of those fans, the breaking point came with the Hot Space album. Instead of just flirting with dance music, Queen dove headfirst into it, with tight drum grooves, funky bass lines, and synth-driven arrangements pushing heavier rock to the background. The record did include important moments like Under Pressure, but the overall sound felt jarring to listeners who expected Brian May riffs and arena anthems. Combined with the broader disco backlash of the early 80s, the album ended up being labeled by a big part of the fan base as their most controversial, and for some, their weakest effort. Almost overnight, a band that once seemed untouchable was being accused of chasing trends and abandoning its roots. Over time, Hot Space has been partially reevaluated by a new generation of listeners, some of whom see it as an odd but interesting experiment, even ahead of its time in certain ways. Still, the scar it left on the fan base never fully disappeared. To this day, fans are split between those who defend this dance-oriented phase and those who insist that this was the moment Queen almost lost its identity. The result is a lingering love-hate relationship. Many old-school followers deeply respect the band's 70s classics, but can't quite forgive the funky, poppy turn that, in their eyes, pushed Queen dangerously close to becoming a completely different band than the one they originally fell in love with.
Number 3. Black Sabbath. The 70s Black Sabbath, with Ozzy Osbourne on vocals, is basically the foundation of heavy metal. Crushing riffs, a dark atmosphere, and albums like Paranoid, Master of Reality, and Sabbath Bloody Sabbath shaped the entire genre and built an obsessive fan base. For a lot of listeners, that classic lineup was more than just a band, it was its own language. But as the decade went on, excess, burnout, and creative fatigue started to take over. When Ozzy left and Ronnie James Dio stepped in as lead singer in the early 80s, the shock was instant. Musically, the band sounded reborn. Emotionally, a portion of the fans simply refused to accept the change. The Dio era, with albums like Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules, showcased a sharper, more energetic Sabbath, with soaring, epic vocal lines and a different feel that leaned more toward heroic than doomed. Many fans and critics came to see those records as stone-cold classics, proof that the band still had plenty of life left. But for a significant slice of the fan base, the equation was simple. Sabbath without Ozzy isn't Sabbath. They saw the shift as a break in identity, as if a different band had put on the same name. Instead of following the new direction, they rejected it on principle, fueling an almost tribal rivalry between the Ozzy camp and the Dio camp. That internal split left lasting scars. Over the years, arguments about which lineup represents the real Black Sabbath became almost as common as discussions about the albums themselves. Some fans embraced both eras, accepting them as different visions under the same banner. Others still insist that only the original configuration truly counts. In the end, Sabbath became one of those bands that is deeply loved, yet heavily debated within its own community. The very history that built the legend also helped create resentment. For many old-school followers, the band they fell in love with in the 70s never quite came back in the same form after that turning point.
Number 2. The Eagles. The Eagles are a strange case of a band that is, at the same time, beloved as the soundtrack to an entire era and hated as the ultimate symbol of corporate rock. In the 1970s, they ruled radio with a carefully balanced blend of rock, country, and soft pop on albums like On the Border, One of These Nights, and, of course, Hotel California. The flawless vocal harmonies, the stories about highways, decadence, and broken dreams, and the ultra-clean production created a sound that felt tailor-made to be played non-stop on classic rock stations. That won them millions of fans, but it also made some people feel like everything was a little too neat, too controlled, almost lab-designed. That sense of total control showed up in how they ran their career as well. The Eagles became synonymous with extreme professionalism, huge tours, and a hit-making machine that rarely missed a note. At the same time, stories about internal fights, clashing egos, hard-nosed business decisions, and near-obsessive perfectionism started to circulate. For a part of the rock audience, especially those attached to a rougher, more spontaneous ideal, this made the band feel like the exact opposite of what rock was supposed to be. They started to look like the corporate suits of rock music. Tight, polished, highly efficient, but wrapped in a cold aura that annoyed people who wanted something more raw. Over the years, the Eagles have ended up in a rare category. A band many people love to listen to, but also love to say they hate. Some listeners reject them out of sheer overexposure, tired of hearing Hotel California for the 1,000th time. Others point to the calculated vibe, the serious, almost business-like attitude, and the heavy focus on squeezing every last drop of value out of their fan base. At the same time, their shows still sell out. Their compilations move endlessly, and new generations discover them as a core reference for classic rock. That mix of admiration, fatigue, and resentment makes the Eagles a textbook example of how a band can live inside millions of people's memories and still be a constant target of rejection, even among self-proclaimed rock purists. Number 1. Kiss. Very few bands embody the thin line between worship and backlash as clearly as Kiss. In the 1970s, they arrived like a rock and roll comic book. Heavy makeup, larger-than-life characters, explosions on stage, and a visual identity that turned every show into a live-action spectacle. For many fans, especially teenagers at the time, it was perfect. A mix of power, attitude, and pure fantasy. But as their success grew, the band turned into more than just a musical act. It became a massive brand. Action figures, lunchboxes, comic books, anything that could carry the Kiss logo hit the market. And that was exactly the point where part of their own fan base started feeling like things had gone too far. The peak of that fatigue came toward the end of the decade, when the group released 4 solo albums at once, one for each member, and soon after dove into experiments that left many followers puzzled. I Was Made for Lovin' You, with its clearly disco-inspired beat, became a huge hit, but was seen by plenty of fans as a sign the band had given in too much to whatever was trending. For people who fell in love with the raw, noisy Kiss of Deuce and Black Diamond, hearing the band sound that close to the dance floor felt almost like a dare. Add to that the sense of oversaturation, Kiss on everything, all the time, and the image of favorite band started blending with that of overexposed product. Inside the fan base, the reaction was intense. Some listeners embraced the whole package, arguing that excess, merchandising, and stylistic detours were part of the band's DNA from day one.
Others began to see Kiss as the ultimate sellout story, a group that traded spontaneity for strategy and mystery for an endless catalog of licensed goods. Over time, Kiss turned into the kind of band it's easy to love quietly and easy to hate out loud. For many people, they're still an essential part of their teenage years. For others, they became a symbol of everything that can go wrong when the commercial side is allowed to steer the entire story.
Looking back at these 10 bands, a clear, uncomfortable pattern appears. Almost none of them were hated simply for being bad. In most cases, the backlash started when they made moves that felt, to part of their fan base, like a break with who they once were. Changing styles, polishing the sound too much, fully embracing the market, swapping out an iconic singer, or diving into bigger and bigger concepts. All of that can be seen as evolution or betrayal, depending on who's listening. In the end, this love-hate relationship says as much about the fans as it does about the bands. We get attached to a specific album, a certain era, a feeling that record gave us at a particular time in life. When the band moves on and stops delivering that exact feeling, it's easy to turn frustration into rejection. But if you step back, you can see that many of those choices came from the same drive that created the classics. The urge to experiment, to grow, to avoid being trapped in the same formula forever. Sometimes it works and becomes legend. Sometimes it backfires and leaves a trail of angry diehards behind. Now, I want to hear from you. Which of these bands do you think was treated the most unfairly by its own fans? And which one, in your opinion, really crossed the line and deserved the backlash it got? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell us which eras you can't stand and which changes you eventually learn to respect. If you enjoyed this video and want a part 2 with more controversial bands from the 70s, 80s, or even 90s, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and turn on notifications. That support makes a huge difference and lets us know you want more honest lists like this, where we talk not just about the music, but about the emotional and sometimes contradictory side of being a fan.